Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're going to dig into this really powerful idea from a recent paper. It asks a pretty huge question. What if the way we're building AI is just fundamentally flawed? And not because of some technical bug, but because of a massive civilizational blind spot.
All right, let's jump right in. Look, we all hear about AI bias, right? And the usual fix is, oh, we just need more and better data. But what if that's completely wrong? The paper we're unpacking today asks a way more radical question. What if that bias isn't a bug we can squash, but a feature that's hardwired into its very design?
The core argument here is that you can't just, sprinkle some diverse data on top and hope for the best. That's like changing the paint color on a house with a cracked foundation. The paper says that approach totally misses the point. Why? Because the underlying blueprint, the architectural assumptions of the AI, they don't change. The problem is way, way deeper than the data. Okay, so here's the absolute crux of it. Our biggest, baddest AI models, they're trained on data that is just overwhelmingly Western. And we're not just talking about English versus other languages, no. It's about embedding a very specific worldview into the machine, a worldview built on things like rational empiricism and market-driven logic. The paper has a term for this, a structurally deficient approach. And the result? An AI that is literally incapable of understanding the full, amazing spectrum of what human intelligence really is. So, where does this lead? Well, it leads to something pretty dangerous, a concept the paper calls epistemic narrowing. Think about it. We are essentially trying to build a universal definition of intelligence, but we're using a blueprint from just one small corner of the world. And in the process, we're just ignoring thousands of years of wisdom and knowledge from everywhere else.
In this whole process, it has a pretty powerful name. Cognitive imperialism. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's what happens when one way of knowing, one specific way of thinking, gets hard-coded as the default setting for our technology. And when that happens, it structurally shoves every other way of knowing, every other mode of reasoning, right off the table.
And this is where you really start to see the stakes. The author, Eric Nsarko, just lays it out so clearly. He says, we're not just building a slightly biased search engine here. No, the real risk is that we're building technology that actually encodes a civilizational hierarchy and presents it as if it's a natural law, like gravity. I mean, just let that sink in. It's a profound and honestly a pretty scary thought.
Okay, so if the blueprint we're using now is that flawed, that leads to the obvious next question, right? What's the alternative? Where on earth do we even start looking for a new one?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. The paper doesn't just critique, it proposes a genuinely radical alternative. It says we should look to African civilizational frameworks, which operate on a completely different logic, a logic where it's not about accumulation, but where the network itself is the wealth.
And that right there is a huge mental shift. The paper points out that for many African civilizations, the main goal wasn't just to pile up capital or surpluses, which is kind of the bedrock of Western economic thought. Instead, the core organizing principle, the thing that held it all together, was the power and the resilience you get from connection.
And look, this isn't some abstract, theoretical idea. We have real-world examples. Take the Sudanic Belt, this massive civilizational corridor that stretched all the way across Africa. It wasn't just a simple road for getting goods from point A to point B. The paper explains it was this dynamic, living, networked zone. The real value wasn't the gold or the salt passing through it. The real value, the real genius, was in mastering the connectivity of the network itself.
You can even see this network-first logic in how societies were organized. The Aroma people, for instance, created this unbelievably complex social structure where every person belongs to multiple, overlapping groups all at once, based on lineage, generation, age, you name it. And this wasn't just some quaint tradition, it's an incredibly sophisticated piece of social engineering. It's a governance architecture that naturally distributes authority and makes it almost impossible for one small elite group to capture all the power. A decentralized system built for resilience.
All right, so that's some fascinating history for sure, but you might be thinking, what does this have to do with today? Well, that's the thing. The paper argues this exact same network logic gives us a totally new and really powerful lens for looking at one of today's biggest challenges, economic development.
So the standard way of doing things, the development orthodoxy, looks at a chart like this one, showing underdeveloped capital markets in sub-Saharan Africa. And it draws a very simple conclusion. The problem, it says, is a lack of capital. And the solution? Inject foreign investment. But the paper argues that this whole approach just creates a never-ending cycle of dependency. So the paper presents a totally different way to think about it. It contrasts that old external capital model with a new one it calls the interconnected synergies model. And it's a simple but profound shift in perspective. Instead of obsessing over what's missing, this model asks a different question. How do we leverage the incredible resources that are already there? How do we start seeing them as nodes in a network where the real explosive value emerges from the connections between them?
And we're talking about huge assets here, things we usually talk about separately. You've got this incredible demographic youth dividend. You have astounding agricultural diversity and mineral wealth. You have powerful global diaspora networks. And you have this deep well of heritage knowledge. The key, the paper argues, is to stop looking at these as just line items on a spreadsheet. We have to start seeing them as a single interconnected system, because the synergy, the magic that happens between them, that's where the real wealth is.
Okay, so we've talked history, we've talked economics. Let's bring this all the way back around. How does all of this connect back to AI?
It's because the ultimate warning here, the big takeaway from the paper, is that the risk we're running is just so much bigger than creating a few unfair algorithms.
The real risk is that we end up building something the paper cleverly calls artificial, particular intelligence. You see, the whole goal is AGI, artificial general intelligence. But what we might actually be building, without even realizing it, is an intelligence that only understands a very specific, very limited, and frankly, very regional slice of the human experience. Imagine an AI that is unbelievably powerful, surgically precise, and yet, at its core, profoundly provincial. It would be like an intelligence that has memorized every single book in one tiny corner of the library and is absolutely convinced it has read every book ever written. It doesn't even know what it doesn't know. Which brings us right back to that core idea, summed up so perfectly in that quote about the Sudanic belt. It moved wealth because the network itself was the wealth. See, that's not just a cool historical fact. It's a fundamentally different way of understanding value. And it's a way of thinking that, right now, our current AI models they can't even begin to compute.
And so that leads us with a final and frankly, a massive question. If we want to build an AI that is truly general, an AI that is truly global, is it really enough to just keep patching it with more diverse data? Or, as this paper so powerfully suggests, do we need to go deeper? Do we need to actually decolonize its very architecture and rebuild it from a completely different civilizational foundation altogether?